Hey guys, and welcome to Politics Snaps. Now I am in Westminster. I'm here to interview Darren Grimes, who is a really prominent young Brexiteer. He founded the BeLeave campaign, which was one of the main pro-Brexit youth campaigns in 2016. It was affiliated to BeLeave. So I think he's got a lot to say. I think he's a really interesting guy, so I hope you enjoy it. If you do, please do give it a like, perhaps comment, say who you'd like to see me interview in the future, and perhaps even subscribe. So thank you very much. Right, so I'm joined by Darren Grimes, who's obviously a very well-known young Brexiteer. So Darren, first of all, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
So I guess the first obvious question is, how did you become a Brexiteer? I mean, obviously most young people at the time supported Remain.
Do you know what? I originally rebelled against my mother's politics. So my mother has always been a big fan of Nigel Farage. And I thought when I was younger that meant being, well, longing for a heyday in the 1950s, going back. But then actually, the more I read and the more obvious it became that we would have a referendum on our membership of the EU, I began to look into it. And there was I remember one article especially by an economist, an African economist, and he wrote about the way in which EU tariffs actually, hurt African farmers more than most of the rest of the world by ensuring that they have tariff-free access on the raw material, but then on the processed product, they're hit by a massive tariff wall, which keeps them farming this raw material, and there's no value in them moving up the supply chain. So it keeps them in poverty, essentially. And that's all to appease French and German manufacturers. And I just could not get my head around how any so-called liberal or progressive could ever advocate such a monstrous tariff wall.
So you kind of figure basically the case against the EU is a progressive case, a liberal case, fundamentally?
I think there is a massive liberal case that isn't made enough, and that's exactly why I set up BeLeave during the referendum, because young people on the whole are more liberal than older generations, and I wanted to make that case, wanted to make that argument.
I mean, do you think that sometimes the kind of liberal Brexiteer argument is kind of like washed out by a more kind of nativist argument? And does that concern you?
No, I don't think so. I think it's entirely right, actually, that people in this want control in this country. I think it's right that people see the way in which the likes of Greece was treated by Brussels, the way in which it's looking like Ireland's about to be hit by harmonised taxation. And I think it's things like this. People look around the continent and see, if we look at what's going on in France, it's not exactly a continent at ease with itself. And I think people are right to want control from our parliament and our parliamentarians.
I mean, have you been surprised by kind of the reaction you got as a young Brexiteer?
I think I'm surprised by the venom and vitriol that has been thrown since the referendum. I think I'm surprised by just how polarised people have become, and I think that's quite understandable given that we have an establishment in this country that is absolutely desperate to overturn this vote. Remember, the biggest democratic verdict in British electoral history. I actually think that's quite terrifying. We are the country of John Locke. We are the country that has exported democracy around the world. I just find it absolutely inexcusable, especially in a referendum, which, remember, millions of people voted for the very first time. And they were told time and time again in a £9 million government-funded leaflet that the government would implement what they decide, that their parliamentarians were, I guess, overlooking the sovereignty of Parliament for that one referendum, and it was the sovereignty of the people that was important. For them to turn around now, I think, would be very dangerous.
I mean, have you been surprised by, obviously, the victory you attracted personally? So I've spoken to a lot of young leavers, and one thing they all say, or most of them have some kind of story about how they were then, victimised, or it seems to be a common thing. I mean, is that something kind of all young Brexiteers share? Or a lot of young Brexiteers share?
Do you know what? I think actually there is a silent there's a lot of them who just don't have a voice. So, you know, we're talking about people here who in communities like that from where I'm from in County Durham, where the media or, I don't know, the Remain establishment just don't focus on people like that. So they don't really get the same level of, I guess, venom that I have directed at me, because, well, why would they? The media just doesn't give them a platform. No one gives these people a platform because no one cares what they think. Because time and time again, they vote in the same politicians. And this referendum was their chance to have their voice heard. And that's why I think it's so important that they are listened to. But I think, no, they don't get the same level of venom because, unfortunately, no one cares what working class young people think.
I mean, if the result does get overturned in some way, I mean, what do you think that would say about British democracy?
I think would say it's not very helpful. And I think if we fail to deliver Brexit, we fail to deliver democracy itself. I think it would be incredibly damaging and cause an upset that we've not seen in this country before. Because no one in their right mind can turn around to people and say that people weren't given ample opportunity. We've had a general election. It's all right. We had a general election in 2017. Actually, if we go back a step, we had a general election in 2015. The Conservatives...
Sorry.
That's okay.
Just go silent. Sorry.
So we had a general election in 2015 where the Conservatives won a majority on a platform of we will allow the people to decide in an in-out referendum. So it was quite clear that people wanted that. Then we had the referendum, biggest democratic mandate in British electoral history. And then in 2017, 85% of political parties received a mandate that were pro-Brexit. You know, they were the ones that were voted in by people. Actually, I think for our establishment to turn around to them now and say people didn't know what they voted for, when actually there'd been 3 opportunities. If there was this swell of anti-Brexit opinion, by now I think that would have been expressed, and it just hasn't been. You know, I can't stress enough that this is the country of John Locke. Yeah. How can we turn around to other countries around the world and lecture them about their lack of democracy, the lack of openness, and sort of champion ourselves as the home of liberal democracy, and then overturn our country's biggest ever vote, in which millions of people decided to come out for the first time and vote for this positive change? I think that would be incredibly damaging.
I mean, do you think the UK's negotiating position has been weakened somewhat by some of those who are pushing for a second referendum?
I would actually. I think when you look at the likes of Nick Clegg, I remember this one, I was so angry when I saw it. There was this one event where Nick Clegg, Michael Heseltine and Ken Clarke all went off to Brussels to meet with Michel Barnier and convince him that to just drag the process out until the very last minute, because it's looking more and more likely that they would get a second referendum and overturn the vote. And they're even talking about things like changing the franchise, including EU nationals, or having votes
16,
at 16. Yeah. And I think to do that, it's sort of backroom trickery to try and get the vote, the right vote that they want, that these people are so desperate to be attached to Brussels that they will damage democracy in this country. I just can't quite get my head around it, to be honest with you.
I mean, obviously, a second referendum is, let's say, one possibility, but perhaps more likely is Theresa May's deal, or something similar to like a customs union style arrangement, something like that. Would you regard those as honouring a referendum result?
No, I don't actually. We were told time and time. The point that I've just made to you earlier about one of the first things that made me realise I was Eurosceptic was that article on the tariff wall, in the way in which the EU hurts, well, starves, I guess, African economies and others into submission through its very high tariff wall and protectionism. That's a big part of leaving the customs union, and actually that we were told in that referendum that leaving the EU's customs union meant that we would have the freedom or the autonomy to reduce prices in our shops on things like food, clothing and footwear, which disproportionately hit the poorest in society. And actually I think that those are the people that, you know, you've got people like Tim Martin of Wetherspoons, who's out making the case for this very argument for reducing prices on food, clothing and footwear, because he recognises that it hits the poorest who use his pubs, who he meets on a daily basis. Why aren't our MPs making that argument? Why are our MPs so wedded to Brussels that they are quite happy for our consumers to be hit by this really protectionist racket? I just can't get my head around it. So no, I don't think that would be respecting the result of the referendum. I think it was quite clear that we would have an independent trade policy. That means leaving the customs union. It meant that we would take back control of our laws. That means leaving the single market and the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. So I think those two things are it's pretty crystal clear to me.
I mean, do you think that Brexit has become a class issue? As someone from working class background yourself, obviously, it's...
I guess that's a hard one to answer, and I'll tell you why. Because obviously I work in Westminster,
sure,
and I'm not exactly surrounded by my family on a daily basis. But when I go back home, and when I'm in Westminster, you know, you've got your middle class leavers here, and their views are the same as my family back in the northeast. I'm not sure it is entirely wedded as a working class issue. But I tell you what, the reason why there's not a sort of the same ground campaign that the Continuity Remain campaign have got, you know, they've got very vast coffers by Lord only knows who, you know, this so-called People's Vote campaign or a Losers Vote campaign. The reason why there isn't a Continuity Leave campaign is because, you know, most leavers are from working class communities. They've got jobs, they've got normal lives to lead. They cannot be out there campaigning day in, day out. So they aren't making enough of a fuss, unfortunately, because they're not in a position to do that. So whilst I wouldn't say it is a class issue as such, I would say that there is definitely an underrepresented group in this country that's voice is not being heard.
And do you think it's that kind of play into electoral politics? Obviously, you know, traditionally Labour has been the party of the working class. We've seen that change quite a lot. So in the last election, we got to the point it's pretty much 50-50 in terms of, I mean, you couldn't tell who someone was going to vote for based on middle class or working class, the way we used to be able to. Do you think that if Labour comes out against Brexit or in favour of a second referendum, that could have big implications for kind of like how different social groups within British society, which parties they support? That makes.
If you allow me to be personal for a
second.
Yeah,
please do.
My granddad, so it would have been in 2017. That was the general election, wasn't it? I'm getting my years mixed up. 2019.
Yeah.
And he pulled us to one side, and he said, "Darren, I've got something to tell you." I said, "Oh bloody hell, what's this?" And he sat me down and he said, "I'm going to vote for her." And I said, "Who's her grand?" And I honestly nearly fell down backwards, because this is a man he served in Korea, he was all surrounded by Labour all his life, he was down the pit, he was a trade unionist, obviously a real sort of, he's been soaked in trade unionism and the Labour movement all his life. And for this man to turn around because of Brexit, and it is Brexit that has caused this chasm in British politics, or rather has ruptured it significantly for people to actually wake up, I think, and sort of realise that politics isn't working for them and they want to change it, they want more of a say, they want more of a stake in society. So my granddad voted Tory for the very first time, and actually I think if you listen to people like Sir John Curtis, the BBC's polling expert, in the local elections earlier, it was last year I think, wasn't it? The Tories basically performed better than they were anticipating because of that Brexit back and working class vote that came out for them. So I think it's people like my granddad that the Tory party has to realise is now their core constituency, because unfortunately, you know, the Labour Party doesn't represent people like my granddad anymore. They're moving into a more metropolitan direction. You know, they're more at ease with their leafy suburbs in London now than they are with former pit villages. They find those views a bit unpalatable. Actually, apparently taking back control is a bit toxic for them. They're more than happy to sort of contract their control out to Brussels, I think, which is a very sad state of affairs, but never mind. So I think, yeah, you're right, it is changing. It is changing.
I mean, one final question. So obviously you kind of refer to Brexit as a kind of rebellion against the establishment. And one thing about some rebellions in history is that the people who initiate them aren't always the people who benefit from them. Do you think there's any risk that the kind of true beneficiary of Brexit could be Corbyn, i.e. that the right could become split, or that kind of business interests in the Conservative Party could be split, and that Corbyn comes through the middle and this is his route to power?
Well, I think there's a risk that we listen to lobby groups like the CBI a little bit too much. I mean, the CBI backed membership of the Euro. No one's seriously suggesting that Britain joining the Euro would have been a good idea now. I think they were wrong then, and they're wrong now. So I think you're right. I think actually Theresa May's deal probably does give a bit too much ear to the likes of the CBI. And actually we should be a bit more brave about what Britain can do in the world. We should be a bit more brave about how the rest of the world views us, actually. This is a country that I think could use its significant weight, its significant global trading links in things like the World Trade Organization to work to liberalise trade and be an actual, well, the biggest agitator for free trade in the world, and that's what will create jobs and prosperity in this country. And unfortunately the CBI are a bit too at ease with crony capitalism, and I think that's what's not giving people enough of a voice or a stake in our society at the minute. I think, to be honest with you, I'm coming more closely to the view that we need to smash the whole thing up and start again, if I'm honest with you, but that's not exactly the PC thing to say, I know. But yeah, I think you're right. I think you've put your finger on it. There is a risk of that. Corbyn is not the answer. I don't think socialism is the answer at all. I think that's the politics of envy. And I think what people from communities like that, which I've come from, people just want opportunity, people just want higher wages, people just want to feel like they're being listened to and they feel like they've got a stake in society. And I think Brexit does offer rather the real opportunity to give them that, and it would be a real terrible tragedy if we didn't seize that opportunity.
But Darren, thank you so much for your time. It's been really interesting. It's been a real pleasure, and thank you very much.
Thank you.